I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tips, we're going to be talking about tropes in children's literature. Now, I'm not going to go on a long spiel about all the tropes that I dislike or whatever. We're going to talk about the different ones, but I don't necessarily dislike or like any of them. It's sometimes just a matter of the story itself. What does the story need? And is the author doing it well? It's okay to have certain things and certain tropes in your books as long as you're writing them well and you're not being cliche. And that, I think, is the big problem, is when tropes turn into cliches. So I'm going to start with the most obvious one, the big one that happens in a lot of middle grade particularly, and sometimes happens in adult books as well, which is the orphan slash absent parent or a bad parent who's just not around. This happens a lot. The first reason is very simple. You can't have an adventure if your parents are around. How many books have you read where there's no parents involved and the kid goes through a portal, or they end up on an adventure, they start looking for things and the parent's just not there? It's fine because you can't have an adventure with them there. And I've read books that have kind of turned that on their head and let the parent be a part of the story. But the hardest part of that is making the story about the kid and not the adult. If you have the adult who's always, stopping the kid from doing their adventures and not allowed to go places, that really hinders the story. And especially if it's an adventure story. So that's why the orphan trope exists. It exists because you want to have an adventure, and parents get in the way of that sometimes. They also talk reason and they tell you that's not a good idea. You shouldn't do that. I don't think so. I have seen a lot more stories that are starting to involve the parents, and the parents are there, but they're kind of just in the peripheral. But that kind of leads into the next trope, which is when a character gets in trouble and they don't go to an authority figure to solve the problem. So I read years ago this book, and I cannot even tell you the name of it because it did not stick in my head because I didn't think it was very good. But in the book, the character stumbles upon some terrorist plot and doesn't tell anybody. He's in the middle of Washington, D.C., and he doesn't go up to a cop. He doesn't go up to an agent. He doesn't talk to any of his school leaders, nobody. He just goes off and decides he's going to stop these terrorists all on his own. And I'm like, what is going on? And never mind that I could see, even within the story, how easy it would have been for him to insert adults into the story and still kind of have an adventure and tell it on his own. So that drives me nuts. That is one that kind of drives me nuts when you're like, go to the police, and they don't do it. I don't like when characters do that. They don't involve the adults, especially middle grade. They're like, well, don't tell the cops about this. And no, you should. That's absolutely what you should do right now. Right now, you should be going to the parents. You can still have an adventure and still tell the adults so that you're not the only one. This is also a problem, particularly in fantasy, if a character can prove their fantasy world, not telling the adults because they think that maybe nobody will believe them is a little crazy. Why would you do that? You've got this magical box, why would you not just show it to the adult, open it up, and now they can see it, and you're not on your own, and you're not having to be afraid as much, and maybe they can help out a little bit. And that's a way of turning that trope on its head. The not telling, but maybe you could tell, and maybe they'll believe you or not. And it's okay if they don't. Let your character kind of deal with that, and maybe they feel a little crazy, something doesn't feel right and nobody believes them, and how do you square with that, and how do you play around with that idea? I also want to mention, when I was talking about the orphans, I talked about bad parents. Matilda is a good example of this, of just having a really bad parent who is not helpful at all. Fat Angie is another book that had that. Oh, the mom infuriates me in that book because she is such a bad parent. And the really frustrating part is that I know that there are parents out there like that, and not understanding of mental health issues or things like that with their kids, and it makes me even madder. So it is a way of playing around with it, but it is really frustrating when it's in a book, for sure. And so you got to do it well, and I think Fat Angie does it really well. Matilda does it really well too, because it's done in almost this comedic way, right? The parents are so bad that they're ridiculous. The third trope, and I see this a lot in kind of first drafts and books with people who've never written a book before, are the super parents and the super grandparents. As awesome as a grandparent as the writer might be, not every grandparent is awesome, and not every parent is awesome. And even the good parents have flaws and things that they miss, and areas that, you know, they're trying really hard, but they just can't see it. I just watched that movie on Netflix called Tall Girl, and the two parents in that movie are trying so hard, and they're still missing the mark because they just don't know how to help. And they don't know how to help their daughter have better self-esteem, and they kind of keep doing it wrong. And I think that that's really fun and an interesting way of kind of playing around with that. That good parents, but they're not perfect parents. And you can have good grandparents who aren't perfect grandparents, and that's okay. And it's kind of fun that way, actually. A trope that I do see quite often, more so with older books, but especially books that are more preachy, is the didactic authorial intrusions. So an authorial intrusion is basically the author has an opinion and they are going to insert it into the book. Now, we all have our own opinions, and they kind of play a part in our books when we're writing. But sometimes it has nothing to do with the character, has nothing to do with what's going on in the story. You're just like, what is this doing here? Why were there 3 paragraphs about this character's opinions about social justice? But it has nothing to do with the character. The character doesn't seem to care about that, and the character isn't, this never comes up again in the rest of the book. That's an authorial intrusion. It's just there because the author felt the need to put their own opinions about it in the story. I see it quite often. I don't love it. I think it could be done well, though, if you make the character actually care about the thing that you're mentioning, so it doesn't come up just once. You can talk about it and then move on, and then you can bring it back up again and let that be a part of the character that you created. Your character can care about the same things that you do. That's fine. Just be careful not to insert little moments where it's obviously you who's talking, and you as the narrator / author are now giving your opinion on this one thing or this topic. You gotta be really careful not to insert yourself in that way. Another thing that I see, and I see this particularly in young adult books, is the trope of the love interest. And all these books seem to have love interest, right? I told you, I'm not a romance person. So, I mean, you can have romance in my books, but just don't laden me down with it. But I'm always confused, and I'm confused in a lot of books, about what in the world these two characters have in common. This trope of like, you're beautiful and I saw you from across the room, or I saw you at school and I think that you're attractive, and therefore, boom, we should be a couple. And they end up together at the end, and you're like, why? Why are these people in love? Like, I don't understand, other than like sheer infatuation, what these people have in common. When I was in high school, I wanted to have things in common with who I was dating, at least similar life philosophies and like beliefs. But more than that, I don't understand why you would want to be with somebody who doesn't have any interests that are similar to yours. I recently read a book, I was editing a book, and the characters had nothing in common, and they were in early college, like freshman year of college. I was like, why are you dating each other? Like, you don't even like the same things. How is this going to work out? Is this going to be a long-term thing? You seem to think it's going to be a long-term thing. I don't understand it. I actually want to call out this series, my favorite. L.A. Meyer wrote this great Bloody Jack series. I adore the books, and I don't think she should be with main character. And by book 3, I didn't care if she ever ended up with Jamie. If you read the books, you understand. I don't care if she ends up with Jamie. Why is she with him? They have nothing in common other than they were like 11 years old when they met. It blows my mind. I love the series and I love Jackie, but I can't figure out why she wants to be with Jamie. So that's a trope that kind of drives me a little nuts, and I don't understand it. And I think that there's a way to do it well, and even play around with it and have two characters who meet and maybe they're a little infatuated with each other, and then realize, you know what? We have nothing in common. Why I like you. I thought I liked you. but I don't think this is going to work out, and especially if it's a high school romance, not saying that those don't last. I know people who have had high school romances are still married today, but just keep it in mind that there's a way to kind of turn that on their head, because that's the way tropes all are, right? It's okay that they exist, but there's a way to kind of play with them and make them a little different and maybe twist them a little bit so that it surprises the reader a little. One that kind of I see a lot, and I'm not quite sure why it exists, but I'm going to give you my guess, okay, is the awkward, uncoordinated kid. I think that the reason why there are so many awkward, uncoordinated kids in books is because the authors who write them were awkward, uncoordinated kids. I was an awkward, not uncoordinated, I did do dance and stuff when I was younger, but definitely awkward kid. And I understand the propensity to want to make a character who is a lot like me when I was a kid, or has trouble making friends, or the things that I struggled with as a child. But I definitely don't want all my characters to be like me when I was younger, so I gotta play around with that a little and see what I can do to make that character different. I see them way too much. I see them more in movies. A lot of movies have characters with inhalers. It drives me bonkers. That is the downside of that trope, is the constant, like, I'm awkward and uncoordinated and I have an inhaler, surprise. And they're constantly like puffing on the inhaler, which I'm like, after the second puff, I'm like, you need to go to the hospital. I'm an asthmatic. If you've been puffing on your inhaler several times a day, you should be heading to the hospital. You should not be just keep on, taking your inhaler as an emergency thing whenever you get a little excited. So that's a trope that can go really negative and make everybody who's awkward and uncoordinated look like they've got like serious health problems all the time. But you can turn that on its head and play around with that and say, okay, this kid's a little awkward, but they seem to still have friends, which is fine. They're a little uncoordinated and they trip over their feet, but that just makes them kind of quirky and fun rather than like the outcast. That's where it gets weird to me, is when, every awkward, uncoordinated kid is also a complete outcast and they have no friends, and I'm like, I don't really think that every kid's like that, and every kid that's awkward and uncoordinated, they just find other awkward and uncoordinated kids sometimes. The two things that I think kind of go hand in hand, but they have to do with a trope that I see happens a lot, is when a character realizes they're crying. Like suddenly they realize that there's a tear running down my face. Oh, who's that coming from? It's me. I'm crying. I hear or something happens and somebody gets hurt and they're like, oh no, I'm upset. I heard this scream and it's coming from me. I'm the one screaming. And I'm like, everybody like doesn't realize that they're crying. Like, and I've heard some rebuttals on this, like, well, I've had that happen where I didn't realize, sure, I've had moments where I've like yawned and had like a tear and I'm like, oh, hey, but I don't think it happens to everybody. I don't think everybody's like suddenly like, oh, what is this? These tears streaming down my face. Because it's usually like they're really upset and they suddenly realize they're crying. And how do you not know that you're upset? You must be really disconnected from your feelings. So that's something you have to set up as the author. You have to set that up, that's the kind of character this is, who's really out of touch with her feelings, so that when they do cry, it does feel weird. I think another one is the smile that doesn't go all the way to the eyes. I don't know really what that looks like. So this is me as the reader. Anytime I read, the smile doesn't reach your eyes. I don't know what that means. I know what you're trying to say, which is that they're being disingenuous, but just say that they're being disingenuous, or it doesn't look like they're being honest, but most of us don't pick up on that. Most of us are not that attuned to somebody else's body language and the way that they smile, and they know them so well that that when they're smiling, their smile usually goes like this, and so you can't tell when it's like that. Most people don't, and so putting that in a book feels just like cliche and trope. Just another, oh, their smile doesn't reach their eyes. Yeah, of course it doesn't. You know, like I've even seen it in movies. The Island did that, where the character's like, oh, I knew it wasn't you because his smile didn't reach his eyes. And I'm like, oh, okay, of course. So I'm not fooled by it, and I'm not fooled by the suddenly realizing you're crying either. All right, so the next one, because I've only got 2 more. Okay, I'm not going to do a whole bunch, but I mean, this has been plenty, right? Is a character who's knocked unconscious and then doesn't have any kind of concussion afterwards. So I was thinking about this actually today, and this is partially why I was decided to do this video, was I like to watch the show Supernatural. But at this point, the 2 brothers should have like severe concussion issues. They have been knocked unconscious like every episode for years, like 15 years worth of being like hit on the head, knocked out, punched in the face. And I know that they've got some angel that like heals them up all the time, which is good, because these brothers should have some serious memory loss issues, just because of the amount of damage that they've taken, and how once you've had a concussion, you're more susceptible to more concussions. So these guys should have like some severe brain damage at this point because of the amount of times they've been hit and hurt and knocked out and all that stuff. So that's something that kind of is a trope. Characters get knocked out and then they wake up and they're perfectly fine. It also happens if a character is not knocked unconscious through like a needle, like they're like given a shot or something, or they're knocked out because of, you know, a drug or something like that. We've all seen the videos of how people act when they wake up after being under anesthesia. You know, that's a way to play around with that trope. They get knocked out, they wake up, they're a little loopy, and they have no idea what's going on, and they're kind of in our world, but their brain's still kind of dreaming, so they can't quite, you know, differentiate between the real world and the world they're in currently. That's a fun thing to play around with, and I don't see a lot of authors doing it, and I don't think they're doing it because they don't think about it, you know. And the knocked on the head thing, though, I see a lot of characters that get knocked on the head, they wake up, they don't even have a headache, like nothing, like they were completely knocked out, they've been unconscious for like 8 hours. I'm reading a book right now that does this, and he doesn't even have a headache afterwards, and I'm like, you should have a headache after being knocked out and you're unconscious for that long. Or, you know, and how did they keep you unconscious? Was it a drug? Then you should feel really funny and weird. Let's play around with that and make it a little bit more realistic. Finally, the last trope is characters who are abused or neglected, and they're just fine. So I often rant and rave a little bit about Harry Potter. I like the books. I enjoyed them. But it bugs me that Harry was definitely neglected and abused for 11 years, or 10 years, I guess. He was like a year old when he was brought to the Dursleys. But most of his formative years, he was neglected and abused. And he does not suffer from the trauma that most kids would have because of that. There's a little bit, I mean, it's hinted at just a tiny bit in some of the later books as he's getting older, but I really expected to see that a little earlier. And since the author isn't afraid to go into kind of those dark places with her character, especially later on, I kept wanting it and expecting it and then not getting it. And in fact, it seems like he almost forgives them towards the end. For them just not knowing any better. But I'm like, no, they were abusive and neglectful and horrible people. And that needs to be addressed in the fact that a character would probably not be okay after being treated that way. You'd have some issues. You'd have some relationship problems or, you know, whatever. And not that those issues can't be overcome and not that you can't talk with somebody, but Harry doesn't go to therapy. Harry needs therapy. Like, in my mind, the end of the book, Harry is not okay. After being in danger all the time and stuff, I feel like Harry would have like some severe PTSD issues and would really need to get some help for him to be able to live a healthy and happy life later on. I know that authors don't have to go there. I know that it's a fun adventure story, but the depth that I feel like that would add to that character and the depth that I feel like it add to a lot of other books that kind of have similar characters, I think is important. It's a little a little different when it's middle grade, but once we start getting into young adult territory, I kind of expect to see that. I expect authors to kind of delve into how things have affected characters in a psychological way, because one, they have the time and the room to do it, but you don't have to shy away from those things either. And that's something that we're actually going to talk about in 2 weeks. I'm going to talk about some of the dealing with the hard-hitting things that middle grade books can really deal with, and not shy away from them, and young adult books too. So those are just a couple of tropes that I see in children's literature. Again, I don't hate them. Obviously, some of them bother me, but I think that the authors should be aware of them, and then you can play around with them, and you can make them yours, and you can turn them on their head, and you can do a little bit of fun things. You can add some depth in there where maybe other authors wouldn't have done that or haven't done that in the past, and just play around and see what you can come up with. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to our channel. I post new writing tips almost every Friday. I've been Venus with Galaxy Inc. I hope your writing is out of this world.